Hey there and welcome to the Naomi pattern sew along. This is for view B, the jumpsuit. Go ahead and get your pattern pieces fit and cut out and meet me back here and let's get started sewing. So let's get started on the front and pin those darts together. And you should have marked your darts on the wrong side of your fabric. And then when we pin, let's flip those pattern pieces over to the right side. And we're going to pin our center front seam. And pinning as much as we can just really helps to reduce that back and forth. So when we go to the sewing machine, we're going to sew that center front seam and we're going to take care of these darts. So let's go do that now. So once you've got your darts sewn, press them down, meaning the flap of the dart is going to point downward, and press that seam allowance down the center front. And so the next step is going to finish the raw edge of this center front seam. And while you are doing so, go ahead and finish your pockets individually around the curved edges. Do that on all 4 of your pockets. It will make things a lot easier for you just to do this first, because once they have been sewn on to the front and the back, it's kind of a little challenging to get into the nooks and crannies to finish it nice and neatly. So I'm going to go ahead and do mine first. And like I said, I'm going to knock out this center front seam that we just sewn on the front. So once you've got your raw edges finished in whatever method that you choose to do, it's time to attach those pockets to the side seam. And we're going to start on the front since that's what we've been working on. So find those notches. See, mine are here. And align your pocket right side together, matching those notches. And pin. And we'll do the same on the back. And we're going to sew this seam when we get to the sewing machine at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to open up those back pieces, right side facing up. Iron my pieces and then they wrinkle up so quickly. Ugh. Find my notch. Right side together. And now we sew those pocket seams just here, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then press that seam allowance. And then we'll be back and I'll show you what we're going to do next to finish those raw edges neatly. So when you have sewn that seam, you'll want to press your seam allowance flat and then finish the raw edge from the underarm all the way down to the bottom of the pant. So you're also going to finish this center back seam through the method of your choice on both back pieces. And then you'll finish the raw edge of just the bottom of your front facing and the raw edge of the bottom of your back facing on both pieces. So I'm going to go press my pieces out again because they just got balled up again. And I'm going to finish all of those raw edges and I'll meet you back here. So next up, we're going to work on the front. Grab your front piece and your front facing that you just finished the raw edges on. And you're going to align those right sides together. And we're going to be focusing on this inner seam here first. So that's where I want you to pin. So when we sew, we're going to start here, down to the V, pivot, and back up in one continuous seam. We are not sewing across the top. Do not sew this. We're just sewing here, all the way down, and back up. So get that pinned. So go ahead and sew that, and I'll meet you back here. So once you've got your facing on, grab some scissors and you're going to trim that seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch. Then next, grab some small scissors like these or some very sharp scissors, and you're going to snip into that neckline to your stitching line, but not through it. So you don't want to break that actual stitching line. So I'm going to walk around my table so I can get the right angle. I'm just going to give a small snip right there. And that really helps to accentuate that neckline when you go to fold this facing to the inside. Then you'll get that V instead of a U, okay? So now we're going to press that seam allowance up, meaning you're going to press it towards your facing. So go to your iron and press your seam allowance this way. Once you've done your pressing, we're going to understitch. So I'm going to show you where that goes. So looking at the wrong side of your jumper, my facing is opened out. We're actually going to stitch this seam allowance that we just pressed. We're going to stitch that down to the facing. Now we're going to do it on the right side though. That's why it's important to give this a nice press and make sure that that seam allowance is pressed neatly up and laying on your facing. So when you turn it over, all you have to do is start from the top, and you can see here the shadow of my seam allowance here. You're going to sew about a scant width from this seam line to the right of your seam line on your facing, all the way down. Make sure your facing is opened out the whole time, all the way down and around and back up to the top. And that's how you're going to understitch. So go ahead and do that. So here's a little bit of up close and personal with my understitching. And once this is done, we are going to flip our facing back down, right side together with the front of our jumpsuit. And we're going to work on the other side of the strap. So let's pin those raw edges together. And we're going to pin along this armhole all the way up to the top of the strap and across. So when we sew, that's what we're going to sew. We're going to close up the top and on down. And just repeat that on the other side. And now we're ready to go sew. Okay, so now that we've closed that up, we will be trimming that seam allowance just like we did on the other side. Okay, so we've done that. And for the curves of the armhole, you can take your scissors and clip into those curves a little bit. It'll help, again, to create a flatter situation when you go to turn it. So you're just taking some scissors, snipping in about every inch or so into that curved armhole. And then essentially we're going to do the same thing. We are going to open out our facing where we can, which is now limited to the sides right around the underarm because we've now closed up the straps. So you're gonna open out the facing, give it a press with that seam allowance up towards the facing, and then from the outside, you're gonna understitch as far as you can, which will probably be till about here. So go ahead and do that. So now that you've got that done, it's time to turn your straps to the right side. And give that a good press. And then we're going to move on to the back. So essentially we're going to be doing the same thing on our back pieces. So I'm laying out my back, both of my back pieces right side up. And grab your facing, right side together. You're going to align it to the back and pin. And we're going to start on that inside seam. And now we're going to sew our facings to the back on that outside seam that we just pinned. So essentially we're going to do the same thing. We're going to trim that seam allowance that we just sewed, flip out your facing, press that seam allowance up towards your facing, and then flip it over and understitch along that seam. Same thing we did on the front. So you repeat those steps on both of your back pieces. Once you've got that side understitched, flip it back over, right side together, pin it on the remaining raw edges and across the top. And then sew that seam all the way up and across the top. Okay, when that seam is sewn, trim that seam allowance, those corners. I'll flip mine around just because I'm right-handed. And again, press that seam allowance towards your facing, and then from the right side understitch. And turn those straps. Once sewn and understitched and pressed, you can turn those straps right side out. Give your straps a press, and then let's move on to that center back seam. So now it's time to join the front to the back. This is my front, right side up. Then take your back, right side down, and pin. And we're going to pin with those facings up around the pocket bag, down the side of the leg. Then I'm going to do the same on the other side. And we're going to go to the sewing machine. We're going to sew these side seams around the pocket and all the way down to the bottom. Press those seam allowances open, and since we've already finished the raw edges, then we can move on to the next step. So now let's move on to the back. This is my center back seam. I've got my back pieces facing right side together with my facing folded up out of the way. And we're going to pin at that seam with the facing we're going to pin at the marking and down the rest of that seam. So from the top, we're going to baste, backstitch, and then stitch normally to finish the rest of the seam. Once that seam has been sewn, press that seam allowance open. Then we're going to attach our front to back at the inseam. So let's open out the legs. And we'll match them up at that seam and pin. And then we're going to continue to pin along both legs. So now that we've got our legs pinned at the inseam, we're going to start on one end, sew all the way across without stopping to the end of the other pant. Once you finish that, press that seam allowance open and finish the raw edges. So while you're down here at your leg, you can go ahead and hem your pants. Unless this is something that you want to save for the absolute last step, it's up to you. But since I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and hem mine. And I'm simply going to turn and press a 1/2 inch and then turn and press another 1/2 inch and stitch this down. So our last step is to apply our zipper. This is my center back seam, pressed open and ready to apply my zipper. So I'm going to talk through this process about at the same level that I've been guiding you through the rest of this tutorial. But if you are new to zippers, I would encourage you to follow along with my invisible zipper tutorial. I will make sure that this is linked on the screen for you so you can click through to that and save it to your playlist. And if you need to hop on over there to get some better instructions, not better, more in-depth instructions to apply your zipper, then you can follow that tutorial perfectly fine along with your jumpsuit and you'll be able to finish it. So I have my zipper. I'm gonna unzip it and I'm gonna apply it to one side of my seam allowance. And I'm gonna pin it to my zipper tape. And I'm only pinning my zipper to my seam allowance, that's it. Once your zipper tape is pinned, go ahead and sew it in with your invisible zipper foot. If you don't have one, you can use a regular zipper foot. All right, we're in the home stretch. So take out your basting stitches. Once you've removed your basting stitches, we're going to take some scissors and snip off that top flap here on our zipper. Zipper tape. So now that you've removed the basting from your zipper, from the right side of your jumpsuit, you're going to fold over that facing over onto your zipper tape and stitch that down. Just like that. And do that on both sides. So when you finish that stitching, it should look like this. And then when you flip it to the right side, you've got a nice clean finish at the center back. And you just do this on your other zipper tape and put on your beautiful jumpsuit and you're done.